Yeah, great. Awesome. Thank you. How do I look? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to Bass Gorilla Chat in case if there's anything important. So we good to go? All right. Hi everyone. My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel, or sorry, welcome to BassTime rather. Thank you so much to Bass Gorilla for having me on, and it's actually a great honor for me because I've been a member for since 2014. So today we are going to be exploring quite a lot. The course description that I have for you all today is abstract sound design for IDM, but you could have easily characterized this in so many other different ways, like evolution of sound design jams slash mud pies. It could be how to get the most out of a single patch. It could be a non-modular approach into modular, something of the sort. But in the abstract of things, we're going to kind of take a concept and figure out how to evolve on it to where the computer can work for us. So the history of this that I would describe is more so catered towards a modular environment. So if you have experience in anything that's kind of like a VCV rack or a modular environment of that nature, we're going to draw from some of those ideas where we're going to kind of use these concepts to develop a neuro bass, and then we're going to evolve on that to change it into something to where we have an entire suite of sounds for our next track. So the software that I'm going to be using today is going to be primarily consistent of Faceplant and Bitwig 3. You can do all this stuff, honestly, in so many other different ways. We can talk about that maybe perhaps in another video or so. I just find that the demonstration that I prepared for you today is going to be streamlined with the software that I have already. And if you want to look at things that are in further learning from this, you can check out my own YouTube channel on Alckemy. You also can check out Frequent, Echo, Copycat, and Mr. Bill's information because we're going to be drawing a lot of inspiration from them. I wouldn't say that I made any of this stuff up today. More so, I've kind of gone through a refinement process, I think is the best way to describe that. But with all these things out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about some of the sounds that we're going to be developing. So first, I'm going to take you into something that sounds like this. I think that we will most likely be recreating a patch that looks like this, even though just bear in mind, whatever I do today is going to sound different. I will provide this specific patch for you all at the end of the video or so, and also the project file for anything that I did today. But for this in particular, this is what this sounds like. And then after that, we're going to take some of these ideas and turn them into such sounds that I would categorize that are in the realm of things like this. Two of these are playing at the same time, sorry. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with this kind of stuff that I think will be interesting to you all, and the characteristics of what a sound generator is largely vast. There are many different faces of which this can appear, but once you kind of get the hang of getting something set up and then changing small parameters, it's going to be really easy for you to make like as many variations as you want to for these kinds of sounds. So the learning objectives for today is, for one, we need to figure out what a generator is, which I've kind of described. It's just kind of a preset or patch of sorts that will allow you to have a huge variety of sound without having to do a whole lot to it. We are going to build a generator from a Neurobass first, which I guess we should probably figure out what a Neurobass is, although that's a very great term. We are going to explore the nuance and shape timbres within our patch that we have. So for example, this one that I just played is very kind of like soundscapey, where this one might be a little bit more technical. And as you can tell between all of these things, you will see that the characteristics behind them are a lot different. So we'll figure out how to kind of pinpoint making those differences. Then if we have time, we will look at resampling and audio, and then also like contextualizing some of these sounds for use within your tunes. Because as great as I think that these sounds are, if you don't know how to use them, then what are you doing? Or what's the point, right? So let me go ahead and turn all of these other things off. We're going to open up a fresh patch of FacePlant. Now we're going to start with the Neurobass, and there are so many different ways that you can approach this, but I'm just going to show you a very quick and easy way to start getting interesting sounds without doing a whole lot. So we'll open up an analog synth, and then you're just going to set it to a sine wave. And immediately after here, we're just going to stack a few distortions, like maybe ×3, kind of like that. If you hold the option button, or sorry, if you hold the command button, then you can fit little devices in here in this way, and you can also hold option to duplicate. So I've kind of just held option and then clicked 3 times and all that other stuff. The most important thing that I'm going to tell you about this video right now is this little guy right here. The randomizer modulator, or any modulator for that sense, is what is going to allow us to make changes over time. And by manipulating these and setting a few randomizers to a bunch of different parameters, that's going to help us explore the most different kinds of sounds beyond all of this. And now that I've told you that, you'll kind of see through this process how this will kind of evolve over time. So the next thing that I'm actually going to do is I'm going to throw a limiter over here just in case if something gets really loud. And by the way, if you guys are listening live at home right now, I'd be kind of mindful because some stuff might get kind of loud. I do have a limiter on here, but that's not always, doesn't mean that things won't be necessarily loud, right? So the next thing that we're going to pull up is a filter, and we are going to place 2 of these in between these here. All right, that's supposed to be there. And so we have distortion, filter, distortion, filter, distortion. The amount of variety that you can get just by using a combination of distortion and filters together are pretty vast. And so like you don't have to have like a bunch of different like crazy spatial effects and stuff. And sometimes I would argue against it because it can easily wash out your sound. The other thing that I want to talk about before I go on is that these Neurobasses in particular aren't meant to be your sub. The way that I like to explore these, or the way that I like to utilize these, are more so in context as a fill or as an effect. So if you see me do something, which we will do some corrective means at the end, or whatever, it sounds crazy washy or whatever, just keep that in mind that this is one of these exploration ideas as opposed to like, oh, it has to be this, it has to be that. So just bear that in mind. So what I'm going to do now is with these filters, I'm going to turn the slope all the way up, and I'm going to set both of these into notch filter. And I'm going to change the randomizer here to smooth. I'm going to duplicate this, and we're going to kind of just pull the cutoff here, and maybe pull the cutoff the opposite way of this one. So whenever I play a note now, I'm also going to switch this one to the same thing. You'll see that the cutoff between these two will start interacting with each other. And right now we don't have that much interesting stuff going on, but with the next modulator, we're going to start to shape the resonance. And I'm kind of just pitting these two opposite against each other. So now that we have that, the reason why none of this sounds like it's supposed to be doing anything is because the output right here is still at the top, which needs to be at the bottom. Sometimes that happens. So I'm going to pull this back over here, and now this should be drastically different. So from the resonance interacting with each other, also the cutoff between the two notches, you're going to kind of have like a fine-tuned to taste thing here between these two, but you're trying to get the distortion and the resonance and kind of just like the cutoff, I guess, of these filters to interact with each other to create some of those cool nuanced sounds. One thing that I will kind of stress though is that like if you're using a low pass filter or even a high pass filter, generally if you have a ton of resonance more towards your high end, like you have a low pass filter with high resonance, it's going to start to change the sound into something that's squelchy, and some people like those kinds of neurobasses. I particularly don't. It's not to say that you can't do it, but just be mindful of that. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a compressor, and I'm just going to pull this down a little bit, and pull the makeup. And this is going to kind of level everything out. It's not necessarily an essential step at this point, but it's something that can kind of help balance things out if you're really into that kind of thing. So the next neat trick that I have is called Slice EQ. And this is one of the best things about Faceplant and Multipass, in my opinion, because you can use and manipulate an EQ in this way to shape your own filter type. So I'm going to use this cute little thing right here and maybe move this over a little bit. And if you go over here in this way and move this over, then what you can do is you can actually set these randomizers to modulate these things right here. And I just want to show you that this is available. We're not actually going to use this feature right now. We might pull it up a little bit later. But once you have this set, you can actually kind of pull this here and then do independent filter sweeps between all this stuff. So for this particular filter type though, I'm just going to kind of pull out of this, and I'm going to use this here into offsetting everything. So I'm going to change the offset right here, let that move, and then I'm going to grab another modulator here and just kind of change the mix in this way. And as the mix pulls down, you'll start to see that it will change over time in that way, and it will kind of go into this morphing thing that will sound pretty cool. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and go into an actual time-based thing. We're at 85 BPM right now. It will change the sound depending on your speed, but it's okay. So now we have nice. Next thing that we're going to pull up is we're going to go into Multipass. And if you didn't know, you can use Multipass, which is a frequency splitter kind of snap plugin within Faceplant in itself. So normally, like back in the day, this would take a lot of time to do, and there's a lot of different routing options and busing and all that stuff. But kilohertz, you kind of just line everything up. You can even change the frequency range, which is what I'm going to do here, to maybe like 150, and then pull this up to 3K is fine. And you can start processing this within these different frequency bands like independently. So on the bottom end, I'm going to throw the low end in mono, and then I'm also going to grab a filter here and change this into a high pass filter with a little bit of resonance here. There's also modulators within this, and so what we can do is we can grab LFO1 and LFO2 to start doing the same thing, where we will start shaping the sound in this way. This is pretty much all I want to do with the low end here, and by doing this, it's going to help kind of cut out some of the low end. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to come over here and we're going to grab a bandpass.
Recording to logbook.
The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and we are going to change the filter cutoff to this, and we're just going to kind of let this play on its own, maybe around the low mid region. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that even though this is kind of sweeping in a crazy way, the filter cutoff between this band is 167 Hertz to 3K. And so no matter how far you push this, it can't go beyond that frequency range anyway, so you don't have to worry about that so much. So between all that stuff, let's go ahead and throw a chorus on this now. And again, we're kind of focusing on the mid band. Cool. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to mess with the mix a little bit. And then I'm also going to grab a comb filter. So from here, typically I'm pushing F right now, and this isn't really going to matter, but if you wanted to kind of have everything line up, then you can set the root frequency at like 345 Hertz. I'm not really too concerned about that, but what I'm going to do is just kind of grab this and let this kind of play along a little bit here. And then depending on how this sounds, I might even mess with the mix. But you guys can kind of see that even though I'm starting to get into a complex patch here, the premise of this is really just kind of using the advantages of these modulators to start shaping these sounds in such a way. And the reason why this is so convenient for me personally is because no matter what I stack on here, the modulator is always right there. So it's only like one drag away, and I don't have to flip through a bunch of menus to get into. So instead, I can kind of just leave this up here in such a way, and then it becomes a lot easier for me to just kind of work through, right? Sorry. So So we're starting to get some cool timbres from that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a dynamics and I'm just going to pull this down a little bit and push this over here. I'm not really going to go into what compression is just because I don't have the time, but just kind of compress to taste, and then that will kind of help level everything out. So from here, we're going to grab another multipass, and we're going to pull up this preset that's available on the default thing called, I think it's called an OTT. But what I've gone and done is kind of just made an OTT out of that particular preset. By default, everything that you see here is that's turned off. The only difference between these two is that I've turned this off and then set the frequency range from 250 hertz to 3K. So it's so easy that you really only have to do this in like 2 or 3 steps. But this basically serves as a built-in OTT. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but it is nice that this is something that can do both upwards and downwards compression to kind of bring out some of that high-end stuff. With all that being said, after that, we're going to grab one more multipass, and this is going to be kind of like a corrective means, right? And you'll start to see why here in a second. So I'm just going to pull this down into mono, and let's just do 140 hertz. It's not really that important. Then from here, I'm going to grab a dynamics and do the same thing where everything is compressed a bit. So here's what we have so far. Okay, great, but it's still kind of boring. So let's go ahead and push this a little bit further and start making this a little bit more exciting. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a reverb, and I'm going to place this before here, kind of like so. And I'm going to grab these modulators here and start to push this into a higher mix in this way. And you can see that by automating the reverb in between this, that it's already starting to get some cool spatial awareness. And so what this allows us to do is go from things that are particularly in mono to open and closed, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one of those things that allows you to kind of really start to make something seem like it's blowing up and all that, and then kind of moving back. And the more that we take advantage of this, the more that this is actually going to sound a lot more interesting in general. So I'm going to grab another comb filter here, and we're going to kind of do the same thing. And keep in mind that while I am sort of quote unquote recreating a patch, I'm still like, these are always going to turn out different than what I had played for you previously. So just kind of bear with me, all right? And right now at this particular scenario, I'm kind of just moving these things and kind of building this based off of how it sounds, not necessarily what I'm going for. So again, kind of take those things into account. The best advice that I can give you when building these things is getting used to knowing your effects as well as possible, because that's really going to help you kind of flesh out some really amazing things, or really like help you figure out what to do within like making decisions of this entire process. And the opposite way is just throw everything on, throw some modulators on and see what happens, right? Cool. Sounds great to me. So now let's go ahead and start to talk about what we can do to evolve this. Now, making a neurobass like this is just a starting point. The thing that we have to remember is that I am pulling all of this stuff out from a single sine wave. And by stacking a bunch of effects in this way, we've already gone to create different kinds of movement within this, right? So once we kind of push beyond that, then we only have to make some minor changes in order to make this sound like way more interesting. So let's go ahead and introduce a little bit of FM through something like a wavetable. And it doesn't have to be a complicated wavetable or anything. I'm just going to use something that I made. Again, this patch will be available to you all, so don't worry about it. We might cycle through a couple of them. But this one looks pretty good to me. So I'm just going to grab this little purple button over here and go into pulling the phase up in this way. And immediately this is starting to sound like it has a lot more harmonics into it, and there's a lot more for the distortion and the filters to kind of pull from, right? But that's not all. There's more that we can do. Let's go ahead and make another one of these randomizers. And what I'm going to do is click on this yellow button right here, and that's going to allow us to randomize how much FM we're doing from this, I guess, like margin of 0 to 22%. And now that we have that, this is going to kind of cycle between the non-FM signal, or the clean signal rather, into the actual FM source. And to me personally, like, this sounds way better already. But there's more to it. We can also do some unison detuning if we wanted to. So we can go into here and maybe just start off with 2 voices. And I like the synthetic detuning. Don't worry about the spread so much. You can kind of just maybe pull this at like 25 cents or whatever. Sorry, you can pull this at something that I would go for more like 50 cents. And let's see what this sounds like. Nice. If you pull the pitch bend range up and you kind of click on this little thing down here and start to mess with the mod wheel, then sometimes you can check within the cycle to see like if you can get some cool, interesting movement through that. And sometimes it'll work. The more that you change this into like a squarish sound or a saw, I think that that will sound better, but that's just a way to kind of immediately get some kind of, how do I say, variation between the sound, right? So the last thing that we're going to do with this patch is I'm just going to grab this here and we are going to randomize the frame. So now whenever I play this, you'll see the frame kind of jump around a little bit. I lied. I'm going to do one more thing. I'm just going to grab a low pass filter here and maybe grab this one and kind of set that here in this way. So that way we'll get some more morphing and stuff. There's a really cool relationship that you can build between doing reverb signal and a low pass filter. So let's see if that created something interesting in particular. Cool. So that's how we make a interesting quote unquote neuro bass from just building off of a sine wave and a distortion. And hopefully, I know that I went kind of quick just because of time constraints, but you can kind of see the relationship of just starting from something super basic and using these modulators to continue to build and build and build. And if you have a decent CPU or computer, then you can kind of like, the sky's the limit with these effects that you do. Like, to me, this is a basic patch. And it's just because like once you figure out how to do some of these things, right? Like frequency splitting back in the day to me was a big deal because there was like a lot of steps that you had to do. But now that everything is kind of streamlined, you can continue to go further and further and further and continue to evolve on the sound in its own right. So now that we have this, we have a bass plant patch that is, let's go ahead and rename this to Neurobass Vanilla. Let's go ahead and duplicate this patch and let's figure out how to change it into something that's going to start evolving into something cool. And it's going to basically be the same stuff as this. It's just I'm going to start changing some things and adding some other effects in order to make it sound a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and kick things off by grabbing a randomizer right here. And what we're going to do with this one is instead of having these curvatures, I'm just going to change everything from a smooth to a stepper in this way. And with this one in particular, I'm going to grab the master pitch on this and change this into something that's like 48 tones, I guess, maybe. Something of that sort. And it doesn't really matter. You can go as high as you want to, but I find that like if you go anything beyond this in particular, it can get kind of shrieky. So I do want to protect you guys' ears. That's not to say that you shouldn't explore just for the sake of this video. Yeah. So now that we have this, you're going to see everything kind of jumping around in this way. Let's go ahead and take a listen to how this sounds. GG everybody, we're done. No, I'm just kidding. We have more to do. So by just doing something super simple as adding a randomizer to the master pitch, you can start to see that because of the relationship that all of these effects are building with each other, you get these crazy artifacts and like unnuanced things that's not the right word, but like unconventional things that you wouldn't normally make with purpose, right? So building off of this kind of thing, we can kind of continue and take that a step further. The other thing that I really like to do with this in particular is introduce a delay. And delays are really cool because in some form or another, feel free to argue with me on this or up for debate or whatever, but in some way, it is, in a sense, granular. And the reason why is because whenever you have something that's a really short time, it will actually take a really small sample and then repeat it. And so when you abuse the heck out of this, which is what we're getting ready to do right now, sometimes you can get some really cool things. So we already have our modulator set up. Now all we have to do is just kind of like mix and match between the two. So I'm going to pull this up in this way, just kind of like that, to where it's doing its own thing. I'm going to leave the mix at 100% for now. And then I'm going to take the feedback and pull this down from 0 so that way it goes maybe a little bit beyond 50%. This is important right here because if you push your feedback too hard, you're going to get some really annoying buzzing. And if you push the buzzing through other effects, it can be cool, but for this particular purpose, I do want to avoid that. This is already sounding really cool to me. This is definitely something that I could use in particular. But let's keep going just for a little bit longer. Let's go ahead and open this other multipass back up. And what I'd like to do is introduce a pitch shifter before here. I can technically do this before the multipass in its own right, like in the processing chain, but we have this little function right here that's a mix knob, and sometimes that can be really interesting to kind of stack some other effects on here between as well. So between all this other stuff, and at this point, guys, like I'm just playing around now and just showing you possibilities. So if anybody has any questions on anything or at this point in time, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep playing with this patch for a few minutes. By now, just to make sure that we've caught up, now we're kind of in the process of I've shown you how to make a Neurobass and I'm showing you how to create a generator out of it. And right now we're exploring the nuances and stuff that you can use in order to create variation within these sounds. So if anybody is kind of like wondering where we are, that's what we're exploring, so to speak. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to pull this up to -12. Sorry, pull this down to -12, like so. And I'm going to grab one of these and just set the mix like this. And then I'm going to do another one, and I'm going to set this at +12. And the reason why is because otherwise, like when you get these two interacting with each other, if they're different timbres or different pitches and stuff, sometimes it can get a little bit too messy, as you might see here. But I'm also going to use a different LFO, so that way we are trying to get these two to interact with each other in a much different way. So let's take a listen to this now. Sounds pretty good. So let's talk about the actual nuance part now from this particular setting. Right now, everything is relatively dry except for this reverb right here. And so because these are in a step mode in this particular way, what that basically means is that it's going to be choppy and cutty based off of the particular time here. If I wanted to turn this into something that is a little bit more smooth, or I wanted to start making something that has more space, then what I need to be mindful of is introducing another kind of like spatial effect of something like a reverb. So what I can do is I can grab another reverb over here, and I can maybe change the timing and settings of this from a different modulator, this, and now this is one step closer towards creating something that has a little bit more space. So now that we have a little bit more space within all these things, we're still finding this to be a little bit like quote unquote like cuttish, right? So let's go ahead and actually grab a macro now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this towards the smooth curve here. And we're just going to apply this to everything, or all the other modulators rather. And what we can do with this is kind of go back and forth between having something that's curved versus having something that's in a step sequencer. So take a listen to this once I turn this all the way over. And then if I pull the macro over, so you can kind of see that these can jump from back and forth in between to create more variation with the sound. But wait, there's more. What we can also do is grab another modulator here and map this to macro 1 to where these two can jump in between these. And this will be like the master randomizer or whatever, right? Because this is dictating the rest of this stuff. But what you can do is kind of change this into a particular parameter, and you'll just kind of start to see how this will start to do its own thing. Cool, right? So I'm not going to do this, but some other things that we can talk about, just because I kind of want to move on, is for one, we mapped a macro that has a randomizer on it to the smooth curvature of these randomizers, but we can also map all of these to time. And if you want to go even further, you can also map these over to modulate each other, so that way you just get even more randomized sound. If you don't want to do the master pitch, like let's say we kind of turn this off or so, and you have a bunch of delays instead, then you'll still end up getting a lot of choppy different sounds, but every once in a while it will come back to the root note. So I went and turned off this modulator right here, and I only have one delay on right now, but take a listen to how this sounds instead. Sounds pretty cool. So I'm going to turn this back on, and from this point on, what we would get into is something of like doing some kind of resampling feature or something, right? But before we do that, I'm going to turn this off here, and I'm going to talk about some processing effects that you can do further along. Now, I do use some other third-party effects, but that's not really that important. What we need to kind of focus on is all the stuff that I showed you within this particular patch here is the same thing, just outside processing in something like Bitwig. So for example, if I were to pull up something like Slice EQ, you'll start to see that these are moving on their own. And that's because Bitwig by nature has these built-in modulators. And so what's happening is these randomizers are doing the same exact thing as what I was doing within Kiloheart's phase plant, right? It's just now it's outside of the box, and we're getting into things like post-processing. So this is just a brief glimpse about how you can continue to process these things. Like if you want, this is where you can add in like your actual OTT or like your glue compressor or whatever it is that you're doing for how you like to process your basses or tonalities. But there is a couple of things that I do want to show you in particular that I think are going to really help you get some cool movement. The first thing that I'm going to show you is a vocoder, and I have this preset set up, quote unquote, that is just a good one. By default, the carrier is brown noise from a FX grid, and I have some brightness turned up and this kind of pulled all the way down. But using this in conjunction with a couple of other effects, the first one being a pitch shifter, you're going to get more kind of transformative sounds. And these are the kinds of sounds that I've been liking to make lately. If any of you guys downloaded that Aberrant Mech pack that I released for free earlier this year, this is pretty much the same processing that I've done in order to create something like that. But by combining the pitch shifter with the grain size, you can end up getting some really interesting kind of motions and movement through this. So let's take a listen. Now, but at this point, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference because of how many effects are stacked on top of this, right? But just know that when you start to A/B these things and you start to take away some of these other effects, you'll start to see how these evolve over time. So I'm going to pull up a preset. This is called Rondo of Pitch, and these are randomizers that are set up just to let this move on their own, so that way I don't have to set it up. And I'm going to move this before the vocoder. The last main thing that I wanted to talk about with the pitch shifter vocoder combined with this last effect is actually a ring modulator. And this is a great way for you to introduce yourself into transformative sounds. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set the mix to 100%, and then we're just going to start to listen to this until we start to hear this oscillate. So okay, that sounds like a good place there. So now what we'll do is we'll introduce a randomizer on this one. And we're going to set this to curve. And we're just going to pull this up ever so slightly, set this to bipolar. So that basically means that it's going to go up and down at random. So that way it'll go faster, but it'll also slow down. I might have gone too far with this, so let's take a listen. Cool. As you can see, I'm starting to max out my DSP, but you can kind of tell from this that you're starting to get some of those cool, quickly oscillating sounds. Now, one thing that I want you to be mindful of is that if you start to pull the mix away, this is going to sound very like 2010 because it's going to sound very robotic from this mix being in here. And you'll get some like crazy yoys and stuff, if that makes sense. So what you want to do is make sure that this stays in 100%, and then you can kind of go on and start to tune that from there. So the last thing within corrective means, I'm going to end up taking this stuff away in general, but what I would typically do is maybe combine another filtering section. So Bitwig by default has a 3-band split, kind of like multipass, and I've done the same exact thing on here that I did in multipass, where we have a high pass filter on the low end and also making sure that it's in mono. Then on the mid band, we've got a band pass filter, and then what I've done is added a low pass filter on the high end. And whenever I pull this up, and again, I'll kind of place this on the rack, you'll kind of see that it will morph in between all of these things. I just wanted to show you this in particular because this is a great way to use anything to throw into here and make this kind of like move through, if that makes sense. However, once we kind of have all these ideas and whatever, then the only thing that I would send through this is some kind of glue compressor / limiter, maybe an OTT or something, and you're good to go. So for the sake of saving CPU, I'm going to actually turn all of these other things off because I think that this sounds pretty okay without all this stuff. And I'm just going to grab maybe an 8-bar loop or so. Maybe let's do 16 bars. I'm going to push this out. So, and then all I'm going to do on this is hit Command B, and this is going to bounce out everything for me. So now we're going to get into the stage of resampling an audio, and I'm going to show you a couple cool different things that you can do with this. But for this part in particular, the world is your oyster, so to speak, if you already know how to manipulate some of this stuff. So I'll show you what I usually do, and then I'll show you how I kind of get this kind of stuff into making something a little bit more interesting or different. So let's go ahead and group this, and then turn this off. Let's turn this black to there, so that way we can just focus on whatever this is. Now this in particular, I'm going to move this to a new channel as well. That way I can also save some other CPU off. So this in particular is very similar to the likes of something like Ableton. Over here, you've got your warp modes that you can change into, and you can also do time stretching. With the new beta in Bitwig, you can hold, I think it's option. Yeah, you can hold option and do live time stretching on the timetable. But like I said, anybody that's familiar with Ableton should already know that you guys can do all that stuff, right? So what I'm more concerned with is getting some interesting timbres from this. And if you want to process this further to get other interesting sounds, you can do randomization of delay, of more filtering, or things of the like. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to double this in such a way, and then what I'm going to do is introduce a sampler. The sampler within Bitwig is pretty darn awesome. And the reason why is because it allows you to change in between warp modes on the sampler, including granular. So it's got a built-in granular synth. So all you have to do is kind of stretch out some samples on this or take a long cut and just kind of go to town. If I set this to textures mode here and set the playhead to freeze, then when I start playing this and I start cycling through some of this stuff, you'll hear some interesting results. So, sorry, this is like where I get really excited, right? Depending on what you throw into here, you can get some really cool sounding machines and just like really dark and evil kind of like variations of sounds. And by all means, like you can still just do this with an audio, but I find that by setting this kind of stuff up, you end up getting some really cool results. Now we all know about like bouncing this out and resampling it into here, right? And doing the same kind of thing. But I just wanted to show you this step because once you get to this, there's always more that you can do. And you don't usually have to do too many steps in order to get something that's drastically different. So within all this, one other thing that you can do is you can actually set up randomizers on here to do all the work for you, kind of like what I was talking about from before. Hopefully you guys are seeing like the potential of why modulators are so important in this day and age, at least as far as my workflow goes. But having a couple of these set up, so one is going to be on the texture and one is going to be on the grain size, this, then all I have to do is push F and then let's see what happens. Sounds pretty cool, but one of the issues is that it's a little bit too fast, right? So what we'll do is we'll slow this down, then we'll come over here and do the same thing where we slow this down as well, maybe to like a bar, see what that does. A little bit slower. And every time you push a key, it's always going to reset. So you can continue to kind of like move these in between different things. And that's just if you want to have this work for you. Typically speaking, to be honest, I usually do this on my own and I kind of just move between these two and maybe set some motion in between here sometimes. But I do want this to kind of just be aware to you all that you can just be super lazy with this and let the computer do all the work for you. So that's that. Within this, let's go ahead and throw this back in here, and we're going to come back to this one where we have this here, and I'm going to show you a quick introduction, maybe in about 5 minutes or so, how to kind of start to apply this stuff in context. I'm not going to start a track right, but just conceptually speaking, how do you take something like this and start doing things? The first way that you can do this, which is a typical way that a lot of people do, is they'll take a little piece of this right here and move it over, and then start to try to find these little cuts and stuff and to create some kind of like bass line or something. You can do that. I wouldn't recommend it because there's a much more efficient way to do this. However, one of the benefits between working in something like this is that if you take an audio chunk like this, in Bitwig in particular, and you double click right here, you can actually do editing within the comp view here. And so what I can do is go into the audio events, or sorry, into the clips, and I can do time stretching, I can do duplication, I can do re-stretching with all these things and get amazing results just from that. So because everything is in time here in some way or another, how I already had that set up within Kiloheart's Faceplant, then everything will kind of have some particular rhythm to it in general. So all I have to do is kind of just be mindful of the grid or so, and I can start to paste things like this and duplicate, and then I can get like a little bit more intricate with this in general and kind of come in here. I think I want to do audio events, sorry, and grab things like this and duplicate, start to shorten these things up if I want to do chops in that way. If I want to kind of change something or fades, I can do that too, where we would kind of come in there, then you can fade things in. You can also come down here, and this is one thing that I really like, that the inspector panel is always up here, so I can change the pitch of these things, or I can change the warp mode. You can also grab this here and hold shift to do stretching in this way. And you can see that by working in audio, there's quite a lot of micro editing possibilities that you can do within this. And I really hope that people will take advantage of this, especially if you're interested in things like IDM, because this is a whole world that you can get lost in, and I can cover more about this later. The last thing that I'm going to leave you guys with is if you go right click, then you go into slice to multi-sample. This is a similar answer to something that you would consider to be on the same realm of Simpler, where Simpler actually compared from Bitwig to Ableton is much easier. I'm just going to set this to 1/4 notes. And now what I have is a multi-sample of this that's set into 64 different chops. And so instead of trying to find something between here, what I'm going to do instead is have the workflow mindset of setting a rhythm. And so if you start to play something in this mindset where you have, you know, maybe a metronome going for a bar or so, then what you would do is you would come into here and you wouldn't even worry about the sounds. You would kind of focus more so on rhythm of like dun, 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 something of the sort, kind of like this. Doesn't really even matter. And then maybe drag that note out. Okay, these are a little bit too low, sorry. Sorry, phone call. And what you can do now that you have this rhythm is you can actually change this in between something else. So and you know, right now everything is on grid and in time, and if you're interested in doing other like swing things, then you can start to break that up in between. But now that you have the rhythm mindset between this, all you have to do is kind of come in between all this stuff and just create whatever kind of rhythm you want, or change that and then find the right sound for you. And one last thing that you can do is, let's say you have a particular moment right here that you really enjoy. Like, let's say I like this sound. Well, what I can do is I can just bounce this in place like this and move this to a new track and then start to process this with something different. Like maybe, let's say, like that same ring mod trick that we were talking about from before, and do something where you start here and then start to get into your automation and all that stuff in general. So you were to start here from a really low rate and kind of here to this and then make it slow down. I don't know how this is going to sound, but you can start to see that by changing all these things and by working in this mode, you get really cool, just, man, there's so much variation that you can do within this. You can also change the pitch, and man, like all this stuff is, yeah. And so what this can become is it can serve as a rhythm maker, as like percussion of the sort. If you want to take one specific part of this and add reverb to it as a fill or a swell, you can do that too. If you find something in here that has a good transient, you can layer this as a kick or snare, or maybe even a hi-hat. You can use this as a reverse sample. Like, there's so much that you can do. It's really just up to your imagination about how you start to apply some of these sounds that you hear. But what's really important about this is used as a catalyst for you to have just a huge selection of sounds from and try to find something interesting to start throwing into whatever it is that you're trying to do. Even if you only use a bar of this, you still get just, there's still so much variation that you can do between that. And you can use some of these as fill bases, you can do more filtering, you can do all this other stuff. And I just like the potential that I find within this personally is just like astronomical compared to all that other stuff. Now, the reason why I showed you how to do this between a Neurobass is because once you have that, sorry, that's my trash can. Hi. Great, now I need to buy Bitwig. Thank you, Paulo. So once you have that in that particular way, now you can see that you can go back and start to use this as a Neurobass. And you can use these sounds that will complement each other because they come from the same source. So when you're building a sound palette, everything works together in that way. You don't have to do too much processing to be like, okay, I've got these cool sounds, but now I don't have a bass. You can just go back to the original one and turn off all of your not your modulators, but turn off all of the pitch things that change this to a generator and start to sound design with that. So within all this stuff, I've kind of shown you how to go from absolutely nothing to having an entire suite of things. Now, you might need to grab yourself a kick and a snare or whatever, but as far as creating all the interesting sounds that you might need for your track, like, this is already done for you. You can even take, like, you can try to find a tone within one of these and create that as a melody, or turn that into like a harmonic instrument, right? Or something that can be a pluck or whatever. Just depends on how you like to do all these things. But this is a great way to try to play as a dance between the relationship between creating these unconventional sounds that are randomized, but also honing them down in to kind of make something tangible out of it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I really hope that you guys enjoyed this presentation that I had today. This is one of my favorite things to do whenever I stream personally. Like, this is pretty much what I do every stream just because of how much fun it is. So I will leave most of these patches that I pulled up for you. All the ones that I made today will be available, but I think now would be a good time to see if any of you all have any questions or anything. Yeah, really sorry about the call, by the way. I think some people were trying to come in and contact me about getting in, and they're like, how do I get in? And I'm like, I'm busy. So apologize about that. So someone's typing a question right now, but before I read that, one thing that I want to reiterate to you all is that you don't need anything that I just posted today. You don't need any of the software. The only thing that you need is access to some kind of modulator. Whatever that modulator might be, if it has the ability to randomize, or you can create a complex LFO. So I know that Shaper can be a multi-stage envelope. I also know that LFO can randomize within Ableton. You have the ability to make this stuff. It's just not, it's not as streamlined. And you might have to think outside of the box a little bit in order to kind of make some of this stuff happen. And technically, like, you can do this within Serum too. You just have to create a really crazy envelope thing that's going to interact with each other to, yeah, I was going to say, like, you can do this stuff in Serum and stuff as well. You just have to be really kind of um, mindful about how to set up the relationship between the LFO points, so that way you're modulating between the speed of these things, and then you have something reset. The thing to keep in mind too is that if you're in Bitwig and you pull up something like Serum, let's go to an instrument, by using a modulator via Bitwig, right, and by randomizing things, something that's not normally modular, or something that's not normally that you can't normally automate, you can automatically create this into a modular synth just from Bitwig's modulator. So let's say, like, I wanted to move the wavetable position. I just have to click on this here, and then once I grab that, then I can start to push this here, and now it's going to start to change on its own. That's kind of the workaround to that, or that's like one way to do it. That's like the easy way out, right? But if you were to do this within something like just within Serum on its own in a different program, you would have to set up these LFOs to interpolate with each other to create slow and fast time beyond the point that's recognizable to you. And you would also set these into something that's like 3 or so that way anytime you push a button or whatever, it's going to continue to do something different. And you know, don't like disregard the idea of automation too, right? Because I know that I talked about a lot of the different things here of like letting the computer work for you, but who's to say that you don't go in here and you don't like turn this into draw mode and you create your own version of just like, you know, something like that or whatever. Like that's still a possibility, and those things are still viable. These are just shortcuts for you in order to kind of like stop thinking about, I have to go into the DAW and do automation. I can just slap on this piece of software and then let everything else just run. And then also, like, again, if you have like access to the grid or Max for Live and stuff, they have those their own like built-in things that you can take advantage of to kind of like, I kind of have the feeling that anybody that has any idea of modular stuff, like, this should be a cakewalk for you. I'm just kind of showing you within like popular software, if that makes sense. So yeah, does anybody else have any other questions? We still have, I'd say, like 10 minutes or so of anything that maybe you want to see me do or anything to cover. I think that I'd have to prepare or spend a little bit more time on the Serum patch to kind of get it exactly how I want it. So maybe we'll save that for another time. But if there's anything else that you all want me to cover, I'd be happy to like talk about or explore or talk about like the philosophy behind these things. I also hope that I didn't go too fast. That was a lot of information that I applied here. And for anybody that is asking questions, right now I'm looking at the BassTime chat. So if you have a specific question, I'm reading those. From YouTube asks, what CPU percentages do you hit? You mentioned something about getting close to the max, but I think the meter is hidden by your webcam on your... Shouldn't be. It's not necessarily my... how do I say? It's not necessarily my CPU per se. It's my DSP, which is something different, the performance graph or whatever here. But because I'm streaming and because I have multiple synths kind of like lining up, if this starts to go over with a smaller buffer size, then it will kind of start to kind of block itself out. So, I mean, even if you don't have a great CPU and you can't play this, if you pull this patch up and you just draw in some MIDI and then bounce it out, it'll still sound great. So don't worry so much about being like, oh man, I can't even use these things. You might just have to do that or set like a really high buffer rate or something. And also, hopefully you're not doing this while you're streaming. So, you know, take that into consideration too, that I would argue that I'm using more resources streaming than I am actually doing this stuff with Bitwig. But, okay, yeah, my CPU, or my DSP rather, is over here in this area. So there's no CPU percentage over here to the right. That's like, there's literally nothing happening behind my webcam. That's why it's there. So if you look, there's nothing there. Fury from YouTube asks, what's your YouTube channel name? It's www.com/alchemy. Same way that it's spelled there. Got a ton of tutorials online for all this stuff. And I didn't really want to like advertise my own self on this kind of stuff because I was really just excited to do this on Bass Gorilla. But if Bass Gorilla is okay with me like advertising those things, then I'll say that. But I kind of wanted to just make sure that this presentation was brought to you by these guys. And thank you again, by the way, for allowing me to come on. I appreciate you guys just giving me a chance to show you what I know. So I'm grateful. Thank you. Actually, that's the YouTube channel. Sorry, that's my website. Out here, we are more than happy to hustle good services. Thanks, dude. Appreciate it. Yeah. So I guess within all of these things, within me personally, I've kind of diving off the deep end about things. I spent a lot of time on trying to refine certain things of like getting neuro basses correct and trying to make these all work within a track. But the biggest thing that I want to leave you all with on this particular mindset is that regardless of how you choose to use this, this is a liberating way for you to not only explore sound design, but to get something that is that you know is at least going to sound interesting, but it also frees you up from having to be like, oh man, I need to make something in particular. I have to make this, I have to make this, I have to make this. Like, you really don't, because you'll find more often than not that what you're looking for is just a formula and just a combination between these things. And when you add something like this between like phase plan or whatever, and you start stacking things on top of each other, you'll start to notice sooner what effects are interacting with each other. And that will allow you to kind of, I guess, hone in on what exactly you're looking for, right? I like doing this in a phase plan just because it allows me to kind of go beyond things and like not have to be so deliberate with my sound design. Whereas in Serum, you can combine those elements, and you can do that in phase plan too, but Serum is a little bit more catered towards doing deliberate sound design of making exactly what you want. But once you have that, like make exactly what you want, take some of these ideas and then throw that through another processing chain and see what you can get in order to create these variations, right? Because I find that with like the way that quote unquote mud pies or sound design jams were introduced was there's a lot of tactileness to doing this stuff where you let this play and then you tweak knobs on the fly and you're doing everything live. And if you like doing things that way, that's totally fine. For me personally, I don't have a MIDI keyboard. I don't have a MIDI controller. It's just my laptop. So I really want to try to make everything in the computer work as much for me as possible while still getting the best results. And if you're somebody like that, that doesn't have all this like access to amazing hardware or whatever, this could be an advantageous way to do sound design for you. So, yeah, man, I thank you guys so much. I had a great time. I guess if anybody has questions beyond now, you guys can always ask in the BassTime of Bass Gorilla or my own Discord or whatever. But I'm hoping to kind of hang around for a bit. Just wait a couple more minutes for any other questions or last minute thoughts or anything. And I'm kind of curious to see if anybody else here has already made something like this before. But yeah, man, this was cool stuff. I had a great time. If we're doing something next week, then we should have a chat about that. If it's kind of options, you know, kind of options. It depends on. Yeah, we should talk about it. We can explore. We can go more in depth within some of these other concepts if you want to. I can show you how to do this within other programs. So I can show you how to do this within Ableton. I can prepare a lesson if you want to do this within Serum. We can talk about building melodies that are also kind of somewhat modular if you want. We can talk about spending time on transitions. We can talk about actually formulating a song and how I go about doing that on like quote unquote IDM production. I mean, it's really kind of just what the people want and what I'm able and willing to do, right? So there's a ton of things that we can continue to explore within this stuff. And like really an hour, as much as I've covered, an hour of this stuff really doesn't do it justice for like how much more you can go into or how much deeper you can go into with this kind of stuff. So what I also see in your faceplant work is more use of random signal generators. Serum is less strong in that regard. Yeah, absolutely. But that's not to say that you can't create something that is beyond recognition, kind of like what I talked about before. So within this stuff here, right, if you start to create these crazy nuanced like filter envelopes like this, and then you start to set modulation sources from another LFO to where you have all this stuff in that way, then and you have something else that's kind of changed the speed of this over time, like you can still get some randomization stuff within this that will sound pretty cool. Frequent, by the way, I'm not sure if it was on Bass Gorilla or if it was on YouTube, but Frequent was the person that turned me on to this concept because he actually did something like this within Serum. Now, granted, these were kind of moving between macros and stuff that you have to turn, but I kind of tried to take his idea and then see how I can take that a step further. So, but I definitely have to give him credit that he definitely moved me into that world, and showed me how to do all that stuff. Thanks, Ian. Great work. Yo, Alistair, thanks, man. We've been talking for a while, so thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I guess for everybody else, we can continue the questions after the stream. And I guess if you want me to stay on in a couple minutes or if you want me to log off, just let me know what you want to do. But thank you guys so much for your time. I had a lot of fun, and I hope you guys did too. And I will prepare. This will be available like in an hour or so. So let me just make sure that everything is going to work in case if you have Bitwig or Faceplant or both or whatever, right? So thank you all so much. And I guess this is a